So we'll look at the 7 sexist principles that Margaret Alker identified in her work, starting off with androcentricity. So here is that notion that this male view of the world, this perspective from the male point of view, and this has been an issue that's been permeated throughout history and research. Historically, men have been the ones who have conducted research. It's been women have been denied access to avenues for either participating in acting in research, or the research has been discounted. In the past. So that now those biases have continued in many cases, and this is why we have women who during the feminist movement, they really try to bring these issues to light, and so we want to acknowledge that, and we want to understand, when we see kind of male centric terms or male centric research, that they're that it's not that they are actually biased. That this is not a full representation of what's going on. There is the counterpoint of androcentricity, which is gynocentricity, which is kind of doing the same thing but with a female perspective. And some people have used the plot device of using women, the female gendered terms in research, as a way to counteract this kind of male dominated, bias. Obviously, it's not been done to the same extent, but it's something to be considered and something to be mindful of, not to abuse. We want to conduct our research and to be honest in what we're finding in our research, and how our findings can be applied. But the issue of androcentricity can definitely overlap into the issue of overgeneralization. Historically, when research has been done, and if it's only male participants have been involved as research subjects, in the past researchers have cited their findings to be applicable to both men and women, and we've seen this is not the case. As Margaret Alker pointed out in her work, there are cases where women may have had, for some biological reasons, women may be susceptible to certain things that men weren't, so that the findings of, certain drugs that may be beneficial to men may actually be detrimental to women. So these are kind of the issues that we need to be mindful of when we talk about, who makes up the research subjects pool and how that may be applying to the general population. And what you'll find here also, these issues, that may apply to feminism, they actually go beyond just to this group of women, the sexist view, but also in terms of race, in terms of class. There are other issues, other characteristics that we may also find that doing conducting research on one group, is not necessarily applicable to the whole population. And we'll talk a little bit about that after this. But we'll go through these terms. And next we'll talk about gender insensitivity. This is where we would ignore sex as a socially important value. This kind of ties in with the idea of overgeneralization. When we overlook that there may be differences between the sexes. That when applying findings from research that may be done with one sex, one gender, applying that to both sexes. This is especially in terms of health. There may be reasons why we need to look at those differences when they do exist. And next, looking at the issue of double standards, this is where we would look at, we're using the different means to evaluate the same behavior, the same trait, solely based on differences of sexes. This comes out of work that was done around sexual health. When women were, if we were looking at issues of, multiple sexual partners, that we would use terms to describe if this women is being sexually promiscuous, and when men may be described as in either neutral or positive terms, something like sexual exploration. So these are issues that we need to be aware of, when we're doing an evaluation. And again, this applies beyond issues of sexism, but also to include, as we talked about in one of the readings in ethics and scientific research, how comparing, uh, renewable energy power plants and non-renewable energy power plants, how the methods of analysis may be different. We may choose to use different methods of analysis and to come up with a different result, which may inherently create a bias and may inherently want you to walk away thinking that, in the case that, that we discussed in the reading, that, coal plants or nuclear plants were actually better than, renewable energy plants, or at least more cost effective. These are issues that we need to be aware of when we're doing our research and when we're looking at research. The issue of the double standard. Next, talking about issues of sex appropriateness. This is a form of gender insensitivity, where we kind of confusing what the idea of a social construct of gender is versus biological differences that may exist between the genders. Next, we're looking at familism. This is where we falsely use the family as the smallest unit of measure. And again, now, there may be instances where if you're looking at families, that they may be a valid, there may be some validity to using that as a measure. But, we looking at the individual as the smallest unit of measure, that probably makes more sense and is more appropriate. And lastly, we'll talk about social dichotomism, and this is where we may describe the different sexes as biologically distinct groups, rather than two groups that have many overlapping characteristics. There are definitely some differences between the sexes, but we need to be mindful of how we treat those differences. When those differences exist, are they biological in nature, or are these, again, social constructs? So the issues we've looked at here, they go beyond just issues of sexism, but we can also apply, this way of looking at the problems of sexism to other issues, issues of racism, issues of classism, other forms of bias that may exist, and also beyond just those issues, but also, when just doing research, these are things to be mindful of when we're comparing different groups or different classes. How do we ensure that the biases that may be inherent in our culture or in our society, that doesn't influence the way we do our research and what our findings are? If we continue with some sort of a, if you replace androcentricity with some sort of a view that as a view of the world through a particular lens, whether be it through a racial lens of maybe a white-dominated view, or through a class lens, through a wealthy-dominated view, or a middle-class-dominated view, we would see some problems there as well, and we need to make sure that we don't limit ourselves through a particular lens. That we acknowledge where there are differences. But again, that we don't use our biases when we see differences and attribute them to certain attribute it beyond what it means. So when we find that there are, maybe higher incidence of poverty in communities of color, it would be disingenuous to apply some sort of characteristics to those populations as some sort of inherent deficiencies in those groups. Why maybe people of color maybe have higher levels of poverty in the United States, as opposed to looking at maybe historical factors that lead to that. Why are there higher levels of contaminated facilities, pollution sources in low-income communities of color? Do people, low-income communities of color, move to these facilities, or have these facilities been brought to them for various factors? So again, we need to look at, when we're doing our research, to do research ethically, we want to make sure that we're not confusing the different types of these different issues. And lastly, what I want to talk about here are type 1 and type 2 errors. And actually, I think I'd prefer you to go ahead and just check out this next video. They did a very good job of explaining the differences between type 1 and type 2 errors.